So, Katrina, as podcasters, we're always looking for really creative ways to grow our brand and get more ears starting to tune in. So today, what I wanted to unpack was some of those themes or strategies that you talk about in your own podcast, Marketing with No Money, and what are the opportunities that actually exist for our own listeners to actually grow their own podcast with a zero marketing budget?
Oh, look, Danielle, I will say that I'm often astounded by the huge, vast opportunities out there that don't cost business owners a cent. But I'm more surprised by the amount of those that aren't harnessing those opportunities and are instead throwing money at paid activities. So I'm really passionate about exploring kind of those key unpaid opportunities first and foremost before I ever consider for myself or my clients investing in actual paid activities. So I guess one of the key ones that I would say straight off the bat for any business owner would be your brand story. Sharing the story about why you do what you do, to me is so incredibly important, particularly because if you're trying to connect with a female audience, and a lot of people are because females make, more than 80% of all financial decisions, women are emotive and they really connect with the story. So they are unofficially or subconsciously assessing you to see whether your values are aligned. So it's really important that you share who you are, why you do what you do, why you're passionate about it, what makes you different, because people buy you for your differences rather than because we're all the same. But more so, one of the key elements that I would share is it's so important to talk about how you're going to make their life easier.
Absolutely.
Which I think a lot of people miss.
So if I circle back, how did you actually get into podcasting to kick things off with? And what I'd love to really know is, of all the weapons of choice out there, you choose podcasting to help spread your message. So what's the benefit that you're seeing in podcasting to help people to share their story?
Oh, look, it's that share of ear. The key thing is the fact that with a podcast, you don't have any of the noise that a consumer would normally have in front of them with their eyes looking at billboards, with messages coming up in social media. You have that opportunity to share your story, and talk about what it is that you're passionate about, and have that exclusivity with that person's attention. And that to me is absolute gold. And plus, with the time that you have, there's a real opportunity to build a connection and a relationship that you don't get in other, means where you've just got kind of a split second to capture someone's attention. You do have the opportunity to have a longer kind of interaction with a prospective customer, which I think podcasting really presents. And for me, I jumped in 2018. I had watched friends kick off podcasts in about 2016, 2017, and I saw how much work it was for them in producing it and getting the guests and the research. So my initial strategy was very much to guest appear on other people's podcasts, because then I still had that opportunity to share my story and my expertise, but I wasn't there doing all the research, producing it and all of those things. So I did that for the first couple of years, and then it came to 2018, and no one in my space, so I work in marketing to mums, no one worldwide had yet launched a podcast around marketing to mothers. And I thought strategically, there's such an advantage of being that first person to market. So I went out there and did that. And because I was the world's only, and still remain to be the world's only podcast on marketing to mothers, access to get some really top name guests was relatively easy. And I've had there's the CEO of some really major brands over in the States that I would never think would actually allow me to interview them, jumped at the chance. One of the senior people at Unilever North America, she headed up cross-cultural marketing, And it was the very first podcast that she'd ever appeared on. She's now a really key LinkedIn influencer and also has her own leading podcast. So it was really exciting to be part of her podcast journey. But to me, there was a real opportunity to be first to market. So I launched my first podcast in 2018. And then late last year, I launched my second podcast, which is the Marketing with No Money podcast, which is my second one. And I'm thinking about that I
Look
might even
out.
add a third.
She's off and running. We'll see how many you can rack up over the time, hey? And I think I think I actually heard on your podcast, actually, is that podcasting as an industry over the last 3 years has had the largest growth out of any other form of media as well. So, yeah.
That is correct. And only this morning I was reading some latest figures that have come out from Nielsen. I'm very much into research and data-backed decision making. And so I'm always consuming research studies. And I read this morning that there has been a significant growth in the number of women listening to podcasts. Now, they've always been high, but over the last 2 years since the pandemic, they have outperformed in terms of their listening, the amount that they're listening to a podcast in comparison to men. So anyone in particular that's looking at that female audience, it's a huge amount of opportunity there.
So, Katrina, today, like when we're looking at some of the strategies that we're going to discuss, which you share in your Marketing with No Money podcast, and these strategies like the fallback position in case you don't have any financial resources, or are they equally as appropriate if you say flushed with cash, for example?
Danielle, that is such a good question. I've never actually been asked that question, but it's a great one because I think it's actually really important. To me, these are foundations. So whether you have a pile of cash or no cash at all, it is vital that you cover off a lot of these Marketing with No Money strategies first and foremost, even if you do have budget available.
Right. Now, let's move on to the power of niching. And I've worked with hundreds of podcasters and like you, I've researched thousands more. And what I see with a lot of podcasts is they start all guns a-blazing. They've got a really clear message. They laser-like focus in terms of who their ideal listener is. And their episodes are actually adding enormous value. But what I tend to find is over time, we start to see the relevance of the guests and the topics. It becomes a little bit muddied and unclear. And as a result, the numbers start dropping off. So how important is it to have a niche?
Oh, look, niching is vital. What you talk about, I see as podcaster fatigue. Their energy levels are starting to slow down. They know it's valuable, but it's becoming a little bit harder because they've got their first choice guests on already. So I think niching is actually vital. I think if you try and be all things to all people, you are just not going to connect with. You're going to connect with very few and kind of wonder what's happened, what's gone on. It's really vital that you maintain crystal-like focus, as you talk about, that when someone goes out with, that you maintain that. What it might be, though, is that you might have a different focus or a different theme between your seasons, and that can be an area that can keep a podcast host going and keep their energy levels up. And it might be that your audience is interested in another kind of slight deviation from what your core activity is, but you know that it still generates a great deal of interest. That could be, you might just switch up.
Yeah.
A little. So one of the things that I've done with my Marketing to Mums podcast is in the first season, we had really strong researchers, a lot of US focus, because a lot of the Australian audience who are my predominant listeners can't get access to a lot of these US guests. And so my first season really, really focused in on giving them access to new voices that they hadn't heard before. In my second season, what I've looked at is having a look at founder stories. So a lot more people that have set up their own business that are still targeting mums in business, but they're talking about it from a different perspective. So I think by having shifting your theme for each season, but still keeping it very much niche to your audience is one way that you can overcome that podcast
Yeah. And
fatigue.
I remember in one of your episodes, you spoke about when people say, oh, my ideal market's mums age 25 to 45 kind of thing. And when it's across different, like millennials, Gen X, Gen Y, the messaging is so different, isn't it? And what I really loved was your story about your client avatar. Can you share that with us today?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if you're talking
Julie.
about Julie, my
Yeah,
client
Julie.
avatar. Oh, okay. So the story of Julie is that when it came time to identify, so I used to have an online shopping website for mums. It was called Bubbler. I started it in 2011. It was my very first business, and I grew it to a community of 150,000 mums across Australia. And I needed to understand who was my core audience, who was my core mum. And we gave her a name in my business. She was Julie, and we could identify Julie. We knew her age. We knew how many children she had, the ages of her children. We knew that she was more likely to have her children at a public school than a private school. We knew that she lived within 12 k's of her city. There was key facts. We knew that she came to Bubbler because she was looking for unique experiences that took her out of her every day, and that she was trying to address the issue of overcoming that stay-at-home mum isolation. She was the primary caregiver. So we knew her really closely. And so we'd have a photo up in our office of who we thought Julie was. And every decision that we made in our business always revolved around, well, what would Julie say? What would Julie think about that? So it might have been updating the website or putting out a new email. You know, what would Julie think about that? And we considered her in everything that we were looking to do in our business. And I really encourage everyone to have a really intimate knowledge of who their niche audience is, because I do assessments on businesses and how they're currently performing every day. That's what I do. And the number one problem that I see over and over again is that they don't understand their most profitable segment, consumer segment, who their audience is in enough detail. They'll understand it superficially. So as you said, a mum, it's 25 to 45. That to me, just if anyone's listening and that's your audience, that sends huge alarm bells to me, because as Danielle has just said, it crosses two generations. Crosses a millennial mum and a Gen X mum that have very different communication preferences. And if we've got time, Tenny, I can talk a little bit about some of those differences or how that might play out. Okay, so I had a client that was an indoor play centre, and we did a market research study to understand who their most profitable segment of their market was in each venue. They had 6 venues. And what we found is 3 of those venues attracted a millennial mother and her child and her children. And 3 of those venues attracted a Gen X mother and her children. And so what we did is we tailored our communications directly towards whether it was millennial mum or a Gen X mum. And for the Gen X venues, we spoke about the comfy couches. We spoke about great coffee. We spoke about the opportunity to get some other things done. And the reason we did that, we talked about free Wi-Fi, because we know that a Gen X mum really values time and convenience and multitasking more than a millennial. A millennial is far more motivated, around her relationship with her child and the bond. So we talked in those millennial venues about the value of play, of enriching your relationship with your child, having fun together, growing your relationship with your child. So as you can see, completely different messaging styles and preferences. So it's really vital that you understand your niche audience in a great deal of detail.
Absolutely. And go back and review it too. Like that's one of the things I find that it may have shifted, or your thoughts may have shifted as well, in terms of maybe you've moved generations like into that next generation. So
yeah, it's really important actually. I've got a client at the moment that's moving over from being a Gen X mum that they're trying to attract over to a millennial mama. And that transition takes about 3 years over their marketing strategy. So we've got a kind of a bridging strategy in place that will carry them over and allow them to make that shift. But you're right, you do need to tap in. I recommend every 3 years as an absolute minimum that you should be going back and rechecking it because things can change.
Great. Now, just changing gears a little bit here, one of the strategies that you speak about in your podcast is actually becoming a guest on someone else's podcast. And I absolutely love that. For me, it's the ultimate gift of reciprocity in my eyes, because as a host, I know how difficult it can be to actually come up with fresh content each and every week. And with the threat of a looming deadline, you can get this mental paralysis kick in. So to have a passionate guest land in your lap is absolute gold. But my question is, how do you select who's the right podcast for you to approach? And then actually, how do you start the communication with them?
Oh, great question. A big one. I actually first put together what I call a podcast one pager or a podcast flyer. And that's actually kind of like a one sheet page that sells me and what I can talk about. And what I do with that, there might be a theme that I would recommend, that I would like to speak about. I'd have my bio in there, and I'd also put together some suggested questions. And the reason I suggest to my clients to have suggested questions in there, it gives you the opportunity to control the conversation. It also allows you to be really prepared because you can formulate once your responses to those questions, and it can become a rinse and repeat style of marketing activity for you because every podcast has got a different audience. And there's an opportunity for you to do that. And it's 1 hour of your time. It can be a really, really worthwhile investment. So that's the first thing is that I would say, put together your podcast theme. For me, I've got 3 brands. So I've actually got 3 different podcast guesting. I can talk about marketing to mum. I can talk about partnership, and I can talk about marketing with no money. And I've got a podcast guest flyer for each one of those. So that certainly can make it easier when I'm approaching a podcast host to say, hey, here are 3 different things that I could talk about. Or I might just particularly want to approach them about one particular theme. In terms of choosing them, I have a real look at what's one podcast that I know that my audience listens to. So I might ask some of my clients, or I might ask people in my community, what are you listening to? Then what you can do, you can actually go on search on Apple Podcasts, and you can go to that particular podcast that you know that they listen to. You scroll right the way down the bottom, and it will say other podcasts like this. And you can then get a whole list of, they're generally about 7 or 8 that they feature down the bottom of the podcast of other relatable type podcasts just like that then give you some opportunity to then go, okay, these are potential prospects. You might want to listen to some of those podcasts to see if they are a fit first before you make an approach. So that's some of the research that I would be doing behind the scenes before I ever made any kind of approach. I would have made sure, you want to really check them out to see that it is a match. So it's not going to be a waste of both of your time. And then in terms of making that approach, lots of different ways. A lot of websites will actually now have a podcast guest application form that you can fill in. And some podcast hosts choose not to do that because they get inundated by PR firms. Like my inbox is always full of PR firms pitching one of their guests, and they're generally really poorly aligned. So just a little tip out there, if you're a business owner, don't engage a PR firm to do this for you. Do it yourself, because it's going to be just a spray and pray approach by a lot of the PR companies. I'm certainly not saying all, but the majority of PR approaches I get are really poorly aligned and not suitable at all. So if that particular podcast host has got a guest application form, you could fill that in and attach your flyer. The other opportunity is have a look on their content, on their contact us page, and see, is there an email address there? And can you actually then go and send an email? Keep them pretty short. I would never have anything, more than, about 12 lines all up. You want to keep it pretty brief. This is why I'd like to express an interest in being on your show. I like it for these reasons. And this is what I can talk about. Here's my podcast flyer. If it's of interest, let's chat. Really, really simple. And that's kind of the process that I'd be going through.
And I suppose the win-win is, yes, you go on their show, but if you've got a similar target market, that there's a potential guest for you on your show as well.
Absolutely. I've done partnership arrangements where I've featured on someone else's podcast and they've featured on mine as part of a really defined kind of collaboration on what we're both trying to achieve. So that can certainly work.
And that's a really great lead in to my next question, was around partnerships and collaborations, which I know is your passion project and you're very passionate about this area. So how do you develop a partnership with someone when you actually have a zero marketing budget? Where do you start?
Oh, that's where they're perfect. So for me, I can tell you, I in my very first business, as I said, I launched back in 2011. I did some paid activity first and felt like I may as well have thrown $100 notes out the car as I, drove down the street. It was absolute crickets. And I remember reaching out to another woman who had an online parenting community that had the same audience as me. And we were just kind of exchanging our startup stories. And on a whim, I said to her, hey, what about we do a joint competition together with the aim of increasing our email list? And she said, I'm in, but why don't you go and ask someone else as well? And she suggested that I ask Stay-at-Home Mum, which at that time was the largest parenting platform in Australia. And so I approached the founder and I said, look, if I could find a really good prize, would you join us? And to my surprise, she said yes. And over 10 days, I added almost 7,500 new members to my database, which if I had done through paid means would have cost me in excess of $10,000.
Wow.
Now, that only cost me probably about 3 weeks in negotiating just over the telephone and $50 in some competition graphics. That was it. And so for me, that was like a penny dropping moment where I went, I'm absolutely onto something here. And I repeated that format every month with another community that targeted my same audience, that spoke to my same audience, but wasn't in direct competition with me. I did that over 5 years and I grew a community of 150,000 mothers across Australia. And I never, ever spent more than $300 a month on marketing activities. And most of those were just in graphics. So to me, partnerships are something that, wow, you can build incredible assets from. And I took that into my next business, which was marketing to mums. And as a startup, I was writing a book on marketing to mums. And I approached Xero. And I knew that they would be wanting to speak to women in business. And I knew that women in business who also were marketing to mothers were likely to be my core reader. And that's where I had some real strength in terms of my network. And they ended up getting on board and collaborating. And they sponsored a significant amount for my first book. And that book ended up going number 1. So on the business bestseller list with Booktopia. So it ended up being a really great thing. But I was a startup at that stage, and here I was as a startup partnering with a global brand. So I wanted, anyone listening, don't think that because you are a small, you're a micropreneur or you're a small brand that you can't partner up with big brands. The COVID has really changed the landscape with partnerships. We have seen big global brands not have the same marketing budgets that they have had in the past. They're still expected to get really great results and they're looking for new ways of doing things. A lot of businesses trialed partnerships for the very first time over the pandemic, and it has now exploded and increased huge opportunities for small and medium business owners to enter the world of partnerships.
Wow, that's pretty inspiring, actually. My mind's just been darting while you've been talking and going, who can I partner with? So, look, one of the things just with that, given your experience, is there a formula around what makes a successful partnership?
Yeah. There has to be an equal exchange of value. Okay. So, and that's perceived value as well. So it's really important, this thing of mutuality. Both parties or all parties need to benefit in equally. I think is super, super important. The other thing I'd say is it's vital that you partner up with a business that shares the same business ethics as you do. And this is one that I learned the hard way. So when I was doing those joint competitions, partnered up with another organization. Competition went really well. We exchanged the newsletter list at the end as per our terms and conditions. And then her organization started spamming them 3 times a day. And I went, oh, that is so not in keeping with the way that I communicate with my community. And my community definitely let me know what a terrible error of judgment that I made. And I'm so happy that I learned that in my early days of business. It is something when I'm teaching, my clients and my students in partnership mastery, you need to make sure that you pre-qualify a prospective partner before you ever make an approach. So it's, if you might have a list of potential partners of people or brands or businesses that you'd like to partner with. Before you ever make contact, you must go through and do some serious pre-qualification of them, because you're putting your reputation at risk every time you partner. And yes, there are great benefits that can be made through partnership, but equally, you don't want to enter into a partnership with someone and then this horrible skeleton comes out of the closet that really, reflects incredibly poorly on you because you're aligned and partnering with that organization.
Absolutely. So to do that due diligence process or to understand what's involved, you mentioned before about partnership mastery course. Is that something that's open to the public? Tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, given my passion or given how I've seen partnerships can be applied in all my businesses, I have found what happened was a lot of business owners would start tapping me on the shoulder and say, "Hey, Katrina, can you go off and get me some partners?" And I did. And I used to do that initially for the first few years. And I still offer that under my marketing to Mum's work. But I said, what about I teach you how I do it? So you can then open up a wealth of opportunities and you can do that for the rest of your life. Because to me, I run with a partnership first mentality. It's how I run my businesses. And so, probably for about 4 years now, I've been running a program called Partnership Mastery. It's now a 6-week program, and it takes people through the 7-step process that I've been applying now for well over a decade to help understand, because what I find are the 3 roadblocks is people don't know what it is that they could offer. So they're really not clear about what their assets are. So we really get clear on the assets. They also don't know who might make a good partner. And so we help them identify who would make a good partner, how to pre-qualify them, but then also work out what can you ask for and what can you ask for back in return. People are really like, oh, I don't know what I could ask for.
Absolutely. Because when it comes really natural to you, I think that's when you undervalue it in terms of what's its worth, because it just feels so natural to you that surely this isn't something that, everybody else needs. Surely other people can do it too.
That is such a really important point. And that's what I find happens most with small business owners. So that's actually one of the things that we focus on in one of the masterclasses is really about understanding your worth. Just because it becomes easy for you doesn't mean it isn't really valued by someone else. And it's really owning that. A lot of the danger of small businesses partnering up with big business is that small business owner just gives everything because they're so keen to partner with that big name. They'll offer up everything and that partnership becomes really onerous and it becomes one-sided. And there's not an equal exchange of value. It's highly in favor of the big brand. And it becomes a really negative experience for that small business owner. So I teach them the process of understanding what their business objectives are, because if your partnerships aren't serving your business objectives, they become that shiny object. So it's about being really laser focused again. and being very strategic about who you might select, what you might ask for, and what you might ask for in return. So, and we talk about the different ways partnerships could be applied. I've had a situation where, I've talked about my book being funded. I've also had my podcast for the first season. I had that sponsored, but I've been dressed by a fashion designer for my speaking engagements. But mainly I use a lot of content marketing partnerships where I write articles for particular business media once a month. That keeps me top of mind in front of my ideal audience. So there's lots of different ways that partnerships can be used by business owners really strategically that won't cost them a cent.
Yeah. And speaking of, like, I suppose, leveraging skills or things that you have in front of you, often in podcasts, I find that most podcasters, as a part of their call to action, ask people to leave a review or a testimonial and things like that. And then when they actually get them, they don't know what to do next. Like, so how would you recommend? Oh, well, actually, let's take it back a step. Why are reviews so important for your podcast? And then how do you leverage them to actually attract more listeners?
Great question. So we know from our research that written testimonials are the number one reason women buy in particular. So that's because I look at a lot of mother-centric research. But we know that they're incredibly influential. People are looking to minimize their risk. So it's not just about sourcing those testimonials. They must be amplified so they're easy for your potential listeners to discover. So yes, you might get them onto Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, etc. But then what are you doing with them? One of the things that I get a lot of my clients to do is once a fortnight, have a written testimonial put on a branded graphic social media tile that you can put onto your socials. And I look at one a fortnight and keep putting them out there. Keep them top of mind, have them on your website. You need to make sure that they are easily discoverable. So most of my clients wouldn't produce anything without a testimonial included on it. You could even have one at the bottom of your email signature, for instance, with an invitation to listen to your podcast.
Absolutely. And that really feeds in nicely too in terms of the partnerships because, we spoke before about doing the due diligence on who you're going to partner with, but like also in return, they're going to be doing the due diligence on you. So to get that social proof that this is what it's like from someone firsthand who's worked with you, it can be really powerful.
Oh, it's incredibly powerful. And think about the formats too. So yes, I've told you written testimonials are the most influential, but don't discount also using video testimonials. The different format, it's easy to digest. So if you're running some kind of event or you might be doing some live podcasting, see if you can capture some really candid testimonials just on your phone. And look at all those, they don't always have to be highly polished. So I'd be thinking about all the different ways that you might be able to capture them and then amplify them.
Yeah, I think people have got a really big BS detector when it comes to that corporate messaging and things being too polished. Whereas for me, I really like just the selfie video of someone being real and like I'll actually tune in and look at that. Whereas the others, and maybe Facebook has ruined this for me, but I just think it's a sponsored ad all the time. So I keep scrolling. So
with a card, we find we get really good results with a carded, a branded testimonial graphic on social media. So for a lot of my clients, so I certainly would encourage people that are podcast hosts to consider those as well. But to your point, people love the realness of that candid video, as you say.
absolutely. So, Katrina, I could literally talk to you for hours on this subject, but we're coming into a long weekend, so I think that's a little bit unfair on your time. But from your experience, what are some of the mistakes that you see podcasters make when it comes to marketing, and how do they overcome it?
Great question. So in terms of some of the mistakes, I actually think that a lot, as we've talked about already, aren't clear on who their audience is. Yep. And to that point, I also think that a lot get the guest fatigue. I will say I went through that probably about 18 months ago with my very first podcast, where I moved into that. I'm feeling a little bit of fatigue, and I accepted a couple of guests that perhaps I wouldn't normally. And you've got to be careful about what that does. You only need a couple of bad episodes in a row or less than your standard for it to have a longer term impact on your listenership. So you need to be careful of that, of falling into that fatigue. Again, I would really have a look and encourage hosts to be thinking about how they can be different. People listen to you and your show because you are different, not because you are running a similar kind of marketing show or something else to somebody else. You really want to amplify your differences, and in all your marketing, really talk about some of those differences. We've already talked about it. I don't think that people are using testimonials enough, and that's just such a easy no-brainer one. I want to hear a lot more. I think that sometimes people don't tell us enough about what the podcast is about. So yes, we might get that first 3-minute one, but that can also be taken onto video and put through other formats to encourage people who may not be currently listening to podcasts to come over and listen. So I think that is a missed opportunity by a lot of people. So with my second podcast, I took that approach and I recorded an interview with Andrew Griffith. He interviewed me about, so what's his podcast all about marketing with no money. And he asked me some questions, and what we could do, we could frame that up, and that could go out into my newsletter, or that could go out onto my social media, etc. And that's really encouraging people who may not be currently listening to podcasts or may not have discovered it already on the podcast platform to consider it. So I think that that's a real opportunity for a lot of people that perhaps they're missing.
Absolutely. Katrina, thank you so much for coming on today's show. I feel like we're cutting it short because, as I said, we could go on for hours longer. But Katrina, how can people find out more about the work you're doing and reach out to you?
Yeah, look, there's a couple of ways. So there is KatrinaMcCarter.com. That is my central website where you can find out a lot about all the different things that I do. The other one that I'd really like to talk about is partnershipmastery.global. And that is the website which really talks about the work around partnerships. And if we're talking about marketing with no money, partnerships and collaborations is a huge opportunity space. And that will share with you a little bit why there's a free masterclass that they can do there about 7 ways that they could grow their own business using partnership.
Wonderful. I've been on the site myself actually, and I'm looking at that 6-week course going, I think I might have to
it's a great one. I know people get a
Yeah.
lot out of it, and what it is, I think I've said before, is people come to learn partnerships, but what they really learn is a new way of seeing things and how to create and make new opportunities happen for themselves without feeling like they're in like they're really salesy. So it's really about opening new doors and creating new opportunities.
Wonderful. Katrina, thanks so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.